Hello everyone, today we're doing some hardware talk. If you bought an RX 470, chances are you specifically bought it because it's a budget gaming card, and you'll have it paired with a budget CPU. And I have just the right one to test it with. The FX6300 is a 3.5 GHz 6-core budget CPU from AMD. We want to find out how much, if any, bottleneck will there be with this combo. To do that, we will run the benchmarks with the CPU and GPU on stock locks, then CPU overclocked at 4.2 GHz, giving us a 20% boost, a 10% GPU overclock, and lastly, both overclocked. In ideal situation, the FPS shouldn't increase dramatically with CPU overclock. If it does, that's one sign of the bottleneck. If CPU is the bottleneck, we should also see no great improvement when overclocking the GPU. Keep in mind, benchmark footage isn't the one recorded, so FPS may vary from what you see. Let's start with the benchmarks. First of all, we have Heaven Benchmark 4.0 in Extreme preset. With both CPU and GPU on stock, the average was exactly 60 FPS, with minimum down at 21.5 FPS and maximum at 129.7 FPS. With the 20% CPU overclock, the average was exactly the same around 60 FPS, with minimum of 21.3 and a maximum of 131.1 frames. After the 10% GPU overclock, the average significantly rises to 64.9 FPS with a minimum of 21.6 and a maximum of 142.2 FPS. With both CPU and GPU overclocked, we recorded an average of 65.3 FPS with minimum and maximum being 25.6 and 143.4 FPS respectively. This test showed no bottleneck being made. The difference between the third and the fourth test is rather irrelevant to the gaming experience and probably comes down to the minimums which only appear at the first moment the test starts. In both tests we see about 8% FPS increase with 10% GPU overclock, which is a good result. The second one is Rise of the Tomb Raider benchmark in very high preset. Keep in mind the minimums here occur only at the very last moments of benchmarks, just before loading of a new one, so it's not really relevant to the gaming experience as a whole. Also, there's some lag in the recording, but I assure you there was none of it while playing. In here we hit an average of 67.91 FPS with stock locks, with our minimum being just 11.73 FPS and maximum of 147.78. With a CPU overclock we only managed 68.71 FPS average, but this time with a minimum of 22.15 FPS and a maximum of 128.26 FPS. Only 1% increase in FPS is rather insignificant considering the 20% overclock. In the third benchmark, the average a bit more significantly rose to 72.70 FPS, with a minimum of 20.17 and a maximum of 133.60 FPS. This gives us a 7% increase of average with a 10% overclock. In the final benchmark, with both components overclocked, the average was 74.30 FPS, with minimum of 14.78 and a maximum of 156.93. A 9% increase over stock, 8% over CPU overclock, and a 2% increase over GPU overclock, showing us again no bottleneck and no big difference in CPU power. If you want to play Rise of the Tomb Raider, rather invest in GPU power than CPU. Next one is Mafia 3 in high preset. Being so badly optimized, it will be interesting to see how we fare in the benchmarks with increasing the clocks. At stock, I recorded an average of 34 FPS, with minimum of 22 and maximum of 48 FPS. After the 20% CPU overclock, the average stayed at 34 FPS, with minimum being 18 and maximum being 44. The average with GPU overclock seemingly didn't change much, it was still only 37 FPS, with minimum being 23 and maximum 51. And finally, both GPU and CPU overclocked, we see the average still being 37 FPS with a minimum of 27 and maximum being 47. The results here are surprisingly conclusive, since Mafia has no inbuilt benchmark and I can't replicate the exact scenario in all benchmarks, especially since the weather and time constantly change. But we still see a trend of FPS going up by 9% with 10% GPU overclock, which is a very good result, almost perfect scaling. The difference in the FPS might not seem dramatic, but at least we know there is no bottleneck to be seen here. And finally, we have the GTA 5 benchmark. Since it's a very CPU intensive game, I believe we should get some interesting results with CPU overclock. The game was run on all settings maxed out, with advanced graphics and MSAA off. On stock clocks, we had an average of 58.18 FPS, a minimum of 23.45 and a maximum of 137.10 FPS. With a CPU overclock, the average was 64.95 FPS, with a minimum of 24.44 and a maximum of 135.27 FPS. This gives us a full 12% boost over the stock. When overclocking the GPU, the average stayed pretty similar at 64.93 frames, with minimum and maximum being 22.10 and 133.99 FPS. This is where things got interesting, a 12% boost in FPS with 10% overclock. I tried this a few times and results were always pretty similar, only changing slightly in decibels. With both components overclocked, the average came out as 66.38 FPS, with a minimum of 26.16 and a maximum of 130.92 FPS. The end result in here is a bit underwhelming considering the large amount of FPS boost we had with GPU overclock. Considering we already had a head start of 12% with only CPU overclock, I thought overclocking the GPU would give us over 20% better results than stock, but unfortunately it was only 14% improvement over stock and only 2% difference compared to overclocking of a single component, making me think we actually hit a CPU limit and that we will get really bad performance scaling going with an even stronger GPU. This might mean there is some slight bottleneck, but it isn't as much of a bottleneck as it is GTA 5's hunger for CPU power. The results of 20% CPU overclock and 10% GPU overclock are pretty much the same, so it's still more efficient to add graphics power but only up to a certain point. However, I can't see how much more performance we would get with going with even stronger GPU, such as RX 480 or even GTX 1070, which would surely be an interesting comparison. In conclusion, with RX 470 you're still not very bottlenecked by CPU in both games, but it's right there on the edge, and I believe adding anything stronger than an overclocked RX 480 would be too much for the CPU to cope with. Even though in most cases we don't see much of an improvement in averages with CPU overclock, we do see a trend of better minimums and lower maximums in some games, which gives us a more balanced experience and makes me think that is the start of a bottleneck, and if you have an FX6300 you might want to think about upgrade soon. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like or even subscribe if this helped you in determining whether your CPU still has what it takes to game.